What does this sound like from the Odyssey? Andrew, a fisherman, that is a sailor, is condemned to die to the edge of the sea in Patras, but they don't nail him to the cross, they tie him to it. Is on the cross for 4 days preaching, and he says that I'm on my way home and I'm sailing past desires and temptations.
Odysseus
that is
tied to the boat.
Ancient masts look like a cross.
Yeah.
Ships had a single mast crossbeam. There's also a female character whose name is called Maximilla. He tells her to play the role of a soldier. And now each of these literary moments has its own imitations of Greek poetry. Most obviously the Odyssey, but also the Iliad, the Bacchae, and other Athenian tragedy. But it also depicts Andrew as a Christianized Socrates. So we find lots of evidence of imitations of Socrates with some Gnosticizing elements in them. Think of the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus' opponents want to throw him off a cliff. The nostoi of the Achaeans in Greek mythology, some of the people don't get back because they've fallen. In the Acts of the Apostles, Eutychus falls off of a ledge and he dies, but his soul stays in him. In the Odyssey, Elpenor falls off of the roof at Circe's place, breaks his neck, and his soul goes down to the netherworld.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm joined by Dennis MacDonald, one of the high in demand scholars from my channel that I get in the comments section, because they like your work, and you've delved into some interesting areas in scholarship. You're connecting some dots that are not easy to see unless you really do the work. And a lot of people try to do what you do, but they go overboard and they put square pegs into round holes and they sort of make things fit. But it's not that simple. It is not. Yeah, this is a very complex issue.
Yeah, it is.
And so we're going to talk about the Acts of Andrew. Let's let everyone know what the narrative is a little bit, sort of give a little summary, and then we'll go from there.
Most people who are interested in early Christianity would know about apocryphal gospels, but relatively few know about apocryphal Acts of Apostles. And in my view, they are actually more interesting and more revealing about the early church and its multiple theologies and its social ethics and so on than the apocryphal gospels are. Now, that's not to demean the apocryphal gospels. I mean, obviously the Gospel of Thomas and the Dialogue of the Savior and others are very important. But the apocryphal gospels, and there are 5 of them that are the early ones, and then there's a really a large collection of them after that. But the 5 earliest ones, and I'll give them to you in what seem to be the earliest to the latest, the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Andrew, maybe the Acts of John next, but the Acts of Andrew, and then the Acts of Thomas. And they come from different geographical locations, but they are dynamically intertextual with each other, with the New Testament, and with Greek literature generally. And you can use them to establish the social identities, that is, the theologies of various Christian groups. And some of them are actually composite documents so that we actually can stratify the text and to see, for example, because you're a Gnostic informant, there are Gnostic proclivities in the Acts of John and the Acts of Thomas, and perhaps the Acts of Andrew, although I'm a little more skeptical about it. The Acts of Paul gives a very different account of the Pauline mission that you would find in the New Testament, in which Paul actually ordains Thecla to teach the Word of God, and which is not exactly what one finds in the pastoral epistles, and so on. The Acts of Andrew was fascinating to me for several reasons, Neil. One is it had not been scientifically reconstructed, and we still don't have a full reconstruction of the text. And here are some of the problems, and they sound like they're very academic, and I suppose they are, but they're important for understanding how the text works. There are two Acts of Andrew. One is the Acts of Andrew and Matthias in the city of the Cannibals, which became very important in the Middle Ages. We have probably a dozen different translations of them. We have lots of texts, including in Anglo-Saxon and Old Slavonic. But it originally was written in Greek, and it portrays Andrew as an Odysseus-like character who rescues Matthias and others from cannibals who play the role of Odysseus, of Homer's Circe, who turns soldiers into swine. The parallels are so obvious, Neil, that really any non-theological observer would have to say, oh yeah, this is a beautiful literary spinoff. There's another kind of Acts of Andrew, however, and it is preserved mostly in a Latin epitome. That is, we don't have good, reliable Greek testimony to it, although we do have some later medieval or Byzantine Greek evidences of it, done by Gregory of Tours, about whom I may have something more to say later. Okay. The Passion of Andrew, though, was well known and was used often liturgically on his feast day in order to celebrate the martyrdom of the apostle. And now each of these literary moments has its own imitations of Greek poetry. Most obviously the Odyssey, but also the Iliad, the Bacchae, and other Athenian tragedy. But it also depicts Andrew as a Christianized Socrates. So we find lots of evidence of imitations of Socrates with some Gnosticizing elements in them. Some of my students have been convinced, not by me, but by their own reading, that there are Gnostic elements in the Acts of Andrew. I prefer to think of them as Middle Platonic elements, but that really gets way, way deep in the woods. Let me tell you why I became interested in it. One is that the text had not been reconstructed, and so I spent probably nearly a decade trying to reconstruct it from Greek, Latin, Coptic, Armenian, and Anglo-Saxon sources, and came up with what I call a reader's edition, which has my textual reconstruction, which is necessarily conjectural, on the left column, the left page, and en face on the right page is my English translation. Unfortunately, that edition is very expensive and difficult to get a hold of. The English translation is easily available, and you apparently got one from Polbridge Press, but one can also see it in collections of Christian Apocrypha. And I'm gratified by that. But the other reason I became interested in it is that I had written a book called The Legend and the Apostle, The Battle for Paul in Story and Canon, that argued that the pastoral epistles, that is, the pseudonymous epistles of Paul in the New Testament, were a reaction to legends about Thecla, who was Paul's girlfriend, whom, according to the Acts of Paul, he ordained to preach. And it really is still a popular book in certain classrooms on the reception of Paul in multiple ways. I wanted to see if the Acts of Andrew could reveal a form of Christianity that valorized Andrew the same way that the Acts of Peter valorized Peter, that the Acts of the Apostles and the Acts of Paul valorized Paul, and the Acts of Thomas valorized Thomas. And we do know that, in fact, there were traditions that identified themselves with Peter, Paul, and Thomas, and John. There was no clear tradition about Andrew. So I was trying to use traditional biblical scholarship and folklore theory as a way of teasing out an Andrean tradition. And to do that, I got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities that took me to the Folklore Institute at Indiana University, where I worked with people who studied folklore to see what are the folkloric elements in the Acts of Andrew. And the people I worked with and I myself realized there was no folkloric stuff. There was no antecedent Andrew tradition whatsoever. Instead, it was a literary masterpiece. The name Andrew means manliness. Andrew is one of the four fishermen in the Gospels who provides Jesus with a boat to sail in the Synoptics. The story of Andrew and the Cannibals is a very clever rendition of Odysseus and Circe. And it just went on and on. But I didn't know it right away. The last day that I was at Indiana University and ready to come home, it occurred to me that many of the pieces that I was looking at reminded me of my reading in high school of the Odyssey. And I hadn't read it, honestly, in graduate school. I wasn't expected, even at Harvard, to know the Homeric epics. So before I drove home to Denver, where I was teaching at the time, I bought a paperback volume, an English translation of the Odyssey. And unknown to the Highway Patrol of 5 states, I read it on my way home. And I was shocked by what I saw over and over and over again. There are these parallels to Greek mythology. And I had never seen any of that before that event. This was probably 84. No, even, I guess 84.
Nice.
For me, it was a eureka moment. And I kept working on the reconstruction of the text of the Acts of Andrew, but also a volume that has become called Christianizing Homer. The Acts of Andrew, the Odyssey, Plato, and the Acts of Andrew. And that still seems to be a monument in the study of the Acts of Andrew. But it took me almost another decade to realize that what the author of the Acts of Andrew was doing was characteristic of the way earlier Jews and Christians were composing narratives. That is, they had literary models and they would rewrite the story with different heroes in order to show that Moses or Abraham or Jesus or Paul was superior to the likes of Odysseus or Heracles or Dionysus and so on. So for me, this was a hermeneutical breaking point. And then in 1991, I had another eureka moment where I saw the same thing going on in the Gospel of Mark. And from then on, I have just had so much fun, Neil, peering back early Christian narratives to see how clever they are in articulating their new moral visions, their new social identities, by crafting them over against the mythologies of the Greeks and of course, of Jews in the Septuagint and so on. So that's why the Acts of Andrew has been so important to me. But I think it should be important to other people for another reason. And this is actually going to come in the form of a question to you, Neil, because sure. I understand you've read it. These stories are really quite remarkable. If you bracket the notion that they're giving you anything historical, The question then is, what kind of hero is Andrew? How does he posture himself in the context of other ancient heroes in Judaism and the Greco-Roman world? And it can be remarkably entertaining. Now, I'm going to give you one, and I do want to have an answer to that. What was your reading of the Acts of Andrew? But I want to give you one example
Sure.
that was really clear to me. What does this sound like from the Odyssey? Andrew, a fisherman, that is a sailor, is condemned to die, and he goes to the edge of the sea in Patras, and there's a cross planted in the sand. But they don't nail him to the cross, they tie him to it. And he is on the cross for 4 days preaching. And he says that I'm on my way home, my heavenly home, and I'm sailing past desires and temptations.
Yeah.
And he's talking to the crowd, and he says, wrap yourself with my lashes. He's not nailed to the cross, right? He's strapped to the cross.
Right. And that makes it actually worse because he has to suffer longer.
That's right. And then he says, wipe your ears to hear what I say. Does that sound like Odysseus at the mast for you?
Well, I was just going to say, you don't even have to help me out because I already, this is easy. Odysseus
that is
tied to the boat on, what's that? I forgot what that middle plank is called, but it might look like a cross for all you know.
Upright. Yeah, no. Ancient masts look like a cross. Most ships had a single mast and a cross beam.
So to picture this, there's lots of art that portray this very well. I'm showing it. I'll show it right now.
Exactly right.
And it's Odysseus tied up, looking like he's on like being crucified. You know, it looks like it. I'm not saying he is, but he's tied up and he's being condemned to death in the sea, and he's trapped, and he's going far out to the end of the world, basically.
Yep.
That is like you said, that is the clearest motif that I think anyone can ever.
And that's the one that clobbered me and made me say, hey, I want to read the Odyssey again to see if there are any more of these echoes. And they're all over the place, as it turns out.
So let me ask you this then, because is there also a sequence to this that's also, is it just that, or is there more to it than that?
What do you mean by more to it?
So is there a sequence of how the story is told for Odysseus and Andrew? I think there's a sequence that's sort of similar too.
But the sequence isn't so much in narrative, but in sophistication, Neil. When you read the beginning of the Acts of Andrew, Andrew is simply a miracle worker,
right,
and so on. By the time you get to the end of the Acts of Andrew, Andrew is a philosopher.
Yeah. Oh, that's another thing. Let me jump in for this because you asked a question before that. You asked me about who else do I see in it? Is that what you said? Who else do I see in Andrew?
Sure.
In the Judean world first of all, obviously he's imitating Christ. I think that's pretty obvious. I think anyone would mention that. But he also reminds me of a Socrates.
Yes.
Because here's this guy who's a philosopher. He's debating people. He's teaching about piety, and then he's condemned. And his condemnation is Socrates is importing foreign gods, teaching atheism. To a pagan, Christianity could be like atheism. Oh, you don't believe in Zeus? Oh, you don't believe in Hera? You don't believe in the gods? What do you mean you believe in this one man that lived? That's atheism to them. So Andrew being condemned for basically the same thing as Socrates, and he's doing the same thing as Socrates. But here's the kicker. He goes to his death without any fear, and he has people, just like Socrates, just like Jesus, he has people pleading for him, saying, "Well, we can get you out, or let's try to beat the case." In the case of Socrates, and Socrates, no, give me the hemlock. This is the end. Goodbye. And that's how Andrew, in the same style of manner, gets tied to his cross and says, "No. You know what? You guys are going to try to get me out of here. Let me do this. Let me pray to God and actually have him take my spirit away because I don't want to get rescued.
Yeah, it's not spirit, it's soul. It's his
Soul.
psyche. And he's trying to get rid of his soma, his body. And in fact, the language is used exactly the way you see it in Plato's Phaedo.
Yes.
That to be released from the body is to have the soul potentially purified and to have an eternal life. But there's another piece of it that's really a lot of people. Go ahead and say something.
I was going to say I have one more that I want to throw in there. The Greek Alexander Romance. That text sort of, well, I shouldn't say that text. Reading Acts of Andrew, I don't know why. I kept thinking of that text. The way he's traveling and sort of like going to new lands and meeting different people. I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I heard that there's another translation for cannibals that they're dog heads or something. I'm not sure if you heard about this.
Well, it's not a different translation of it, but cannibals sometimes are understood to be dog-headed people, yes.
So the land of the dogheads is in the Greek Alexander Romance. He goes to the land of the dogheads. So if you make that's a big connection. That's sort of a leap, but it's not really though, because they're both going to the land of the cannibals of the dogheads, and they're both, you know what I mean? It's like that. I think there's some motif happening in that sense too.
Well, I want to come back to something else, but to follow up on this, Herodotus, in his history, goes to Scythia, but he knows that the traditions about Scythians is that they're cannibals. But the Scythians that he met are not cannibals. And if you look at ancient maps,
he says there's one-eyed men too, and gold guarding griffins. He says,
yeah, sure. But if you look at ancient maps around in Scythia and in Africa, you have the Latin transliteration of the Greek word anthropophagy, that is cannibals. And what you don't know, you consider to be cannibals. And I still think we have that problem today. You can actually see it in some Star Wars pictures where if you don't know who the people are, you demonize them. And cannibalism is probably as low as one can go. Yeah. But there's another part of that is similar to the Socrates that should be unmistakable to people who have read Plato. There's a man named Stratocles, and his name means praise of warfare.
And he's a senator, right?
I'm sorry?
He's the senator, if I'm not mistaken?
No, he's the brother of the proconsul.
Okay. Oh, okay. I got you.
Yeah. And he converts ultimately to the Christian gospel. And Andrew plays the role of Socrates. Now, remember that Socrates said that his mother was a midwife, and that Socrates' goal was to bring out the inner fetus of his students by giving them trouble, just like you'd have birth pangs of a mother who's about to give birth to her fetus. And the instructions to Stratocles are, Andrew says something like this: I'm no stranger to midwifery. My goal is to trouble you and to bring your spiritual fetus to birth.
Wow.
And those parallels are so striking.
So striking.
Here's the funny thing about that. There's also a female character who's named called Maximilla. I like to call her Max because it's a strong Latin name.
The chastised one.
The chaste one. That's right. Yes, yeah, okay. The chaste one. And he tells her to play the role of a soldier. So here you have Christian paranesis or ethical exhortation that tells the woman to play the role of the soldier and the soldier to play the role of the woman giving birth. I mean, it is so dramatically modern, even postmodern, that we have this gender bending in terms of social values and ethical values.
You know, Carl Jung would call that the integration of the shadow. So there's like psychology behind it of like going to your opposite and trying to trying to embrace what you know, the other side, basically.
Yeah, I suppose that's right.
It's interesting.
So,
But
did you enjoy reading the Acts of Andrew?
absolutely. It's well written, very, 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 very. It's a great story.
It's a great story.
And like you said this in the beginning, and I didn't want, I couldn't agree more. Some of these apocryphal Acts stories are better than a lot of the canon. Like, they're just really well written. Like I mentioned, the Greek Alexander Romance. Everyone knows how well of a story that is. This is right up there with, you know, how fun it is, how eventful it is, how much philosophy is baked inside of it. It's really, really well written. I'm surprised that more, not even Christians, but more people who are into literature don't read this more.
And it emerges in the Christian tradition in what we call hagiography, that is, the stories of the saints. And saints' lives are, in some cases, really quite similar. They're miracle workers, or they're philosophers, or they're, moral outsiders to society. And it's really wonderful literature. And I would think, from a Gnostic informant position, it's useful for saying that early Christianity, from the very beginning, was diverse and creative. And to think that the New Testament, or these texts, were revealed by God and are coherent and say the same thing, is really to deprive us of the richness of this historical information. So I'm not a fan of Gnosticism, except that it is creative. It is an attempt to make spiritual sense of the nonsense of the world. And some of this then bleeds into the Apocryphal Acts of Apostles, and should be considered really an important resource for understanding early Christian diversity. And it is by some scholars. Unfortunately, so many people are committed to the canon of the Christian church that these so-called marginal texts are excluded.
Yeah, and then it's interesting to see how later on, you know, as the Middle Ages, a little past that, different regions of the you know, the Christianized world, I should say, they sort of claim different saints as like patron saints. So Saint Andrew is like the saint patron of I think England, I think it is, or something. But like, they all have their own little areas and regions that, and they sort of like, there's just like a personality behind why they chose that, or whatever the reason is. But it's what I'm getting at is that later on there's you know, theologians and priests and bishops or whoever, they're looking at these texts and these people and saying, that's our personality, that we're gonna claim that as us, basically. So
and other people then take a look at those texts and say, that isn't us, so we won't read them.
right.
There's a name I want to present who really has become, for the English world, one of the great authorities on Christian Apocrypha. His name is Tony Burke. He's a Canadian scholar. And I just want to tell you an exchange that I had with him. It's been common for people in this field to say, we wish that we had more texts of these materials, and we do wish we had more texts. But Tony is equally impressed of how many texts we actually have been ignored and still need to be digested and collated and so on. We could keep a generation of philologians going for 10 years, just trying to tease out how these texts relate to each other and so on. So there really is a richness of these materials, Neil. And the reason that there's that richness is that these texts continue to be in a second category of devotional veneration. And that still is the case for some monks in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox at least, Church as I understand it, that the Acts of John by Prochorus is sometimes used in monasteries for devotional life, even though it is outrageously mythological. They're not bothered by the mythologies the way that Westerners are after the Enlightenment. So there's a richness to this material that should not be ignored.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And when you look at the things Andrew's doing, like casting out demons and just how he's basically no different than Paul and Peter in the sense that after Jesus dies and resurrects, they have all this power to heal and do all these amazing miracles, and he's no different than that. And the question I pose for not just believers but people who take this text seriously is what separates Andrew's story from the text that's in Acts or Luke or something. What's the difference? That's what I want to know. Like, and is there a difference? And it seems to me that the early Christians didn't see a difference. They took it just as serious.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because really, if I were to re-ask the question, that these texts are different from each other, and some are more sophisticated than others.
Sure.
So in my view, the Acts of Andrew is much more philosophically sophisticated than Matthew,
Sure.
but I think Matthew is more exegetically sensitive to Jewish scriptures and law and so on than the Acts of Andrew is, which he really doesn't care about. So
That's
one of the things that I'm interested in, Neil, is what is becoming called social identity criticism. And that is the ability to look at a text with three very simple questions in mind. One is, who is the hero? So, who is the hero in the Acts of Andrew?
Well, Andrew.
Andrew, right. And he's a Christ-like character, but he has these other characteristics too. Who is the in-group?
The in-group, like who is he saving, basically?
Yes, and who are his fans?
So it would be the chastised woman, number one, and it would be the senator's brother who sort of breaks away from that family. He doesn't accept doesn't he get an inheritance and doesn't accept it or something like that, something along those lines?
Well, but let's define them in terms of their values.
Sure, their piety, their willingness to accept Andrew and his teachings, their willingness to sort of detach themselves from the wickedness that is in their world or whatever.
One thing is to avoid temptation, including sexual temptation.
Yep.
Another is to embrace poverty and to be suspicious of wealth.
Yeah.
So the in-group is defined that way. The out-group is defined by those who are wealthy and lascivious,
the strong,
and powerful in society, and so on. So you can actually look at all of the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles and see that Jesus plays a different role, which I would call the prototypical leader. The people who follow him are the self-stereotyped in-group. What are their values? What do they espouse? What texts do they use? What rituals do they have? And the third would be, who are their enemies? Is it Roman power? Is it Jews? Is it Persian religion?
Devils.
You get all this stuff, and instead of thinking of these texts theologically, I find it fascinating to ask questions sociologically. That is, what social world is being created in these texts for the readers?
Yeah. And I just thought of something, because you're making a good point. There's the same, I don't know if you would call them archetypes, but like the in-group, the out-group,
fair enough.
the hero. Now the proconsul, I can't remember his name. It's really Greek. I can't remember it. Do you remember the name?
Achaia,
yes. The way he dies, if I'm not mistaken, he falls down from somewhere, from like a cliff or something. Is that what happens?
What does he fall into?
I can't. Is it? I don't remember.
Probably falls into the ocean.
Okay, I was actually going to guess that he falls from a cliff into the lake or whatever.
And his name is the same root as the Aegean. Aegeates is the agent of the Aegeus and the Aegean. And so in fact, when Andrew's on the cross, he tells Aegeates, you are like the ocean that I'm looking at that is turbulent and in flux, and it doesn't know what's going on, whereas I'm fixed on the cross and I'm heading homeward. So,
But you know what I noticed about that is that a lot of times in these Christian Judean texts, the I don't know, the enemy or the antagonist is falling to their deaths, like Jezebel falls to her death. In Isaiah, he says, Hallel, or Lucifer in Latin, you've fallen from the most high spot. That seems to be a motif in these characters that are the antagonists. They're falling to they're I don't know if they're trying to say that these characters are in a high spot with wealth and power and they fall from that spot. That's what they're basically getting at, if I'm not mistaken. What do you think about that?
think of the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus's opponents want to throw him off a cliff.
See?
Yeah. So no, you get that and you have it in the nostoi of the Achaeans in Greek mythology, that some of the people don't get back because they've fallen. I think that's maybe a variant on the Ajax story. I'm not sure, but sure, that idea of falling into the sea to your death is common. You actually have it in the New Testament. In the Acts of the Apostles, Eutychus falls off of a ledge and he dies, but his soul stays in him. In the Odyssey, Elpenor falls off of the roof at Circe's place, breaks his neck, and his soul goes down to the netherworld. In the Aeneid, you have Palinurus, who is the pilot for Aeneas when he's leaving, and sleep overcomes him and he falls into the ocean. So this idea of falling has to do sometimes with people pushing you, but often it has to do with sleep or inattention or carelessness,
And you notice how
suicide.
yeah, sure. And you notice how all of those examples that you just named, they specify on what happens to them afterwards. For
That's right.
example, the one person's soul stays in his body, the other person's soul goes down to the other world. Or Jezebel gets eaten by dogs. Like, why does that have to be specified? What happens to them after they're dying? Because that's like a dishonorable thing to say. To tell you what their aftermath is, they died. Oh, they could have went to heaven. No, they died and went to the underworld. Or no, they died and their soul stayed right there, and they had to suffer that torment. Or like in the case of Jezebel, she had to be eaten by dogs. That is very specific. That to me says something.
Sure. But the very fact that you put it that way shows how plastic the motif is.
Yeah.
That you can make it do all kinds of things. And if you're conscious of the Elpenor story, the Odyssey, for example, the story of Eutychus in the Acts of the Apostles is really quite a reversal. Instead of Elpenor being unfortunate and spending eternity in the netherworld, Elpenor comes back to life. Eutychus in the Acts of the Apostles comes back to life. You see the same thing in the Aeneid with Palinurus and Maecenas, and that are modeled after Homer's Elpenor.
Wow. So before we close this out, because this has been great, is there any other motifs from those two texts in particular, Odyssey? Because I know you said there was a few of them, and we didn't really get to that, but the Odyssey and the Acts of Andrew that we haven't talked about yet, or do we touch on them all?
We didn't talk about the one that's most obvious. Okay, and I'm going to tell you the story, and I'm going to see if you can guess which one it is.
Okay.
The Acts of Andrew and Matthias begins with a lottery in Jerusalem where the apostles draw lots to see where they're going to go. Now, Andrew does pretty well. He gets Achaia, and he goes there. Matthias gets the short straw. He
Oh,
has to go to the city of the Cannibals called Mermidona. Well, don't look on a map for Mermidona. It's the city of the Myrmidons, who are the vicious troops of Achilles in the Iliad. But the real parallels happen to the Odyssey. Matthias goes and preaches in the city of the Cannibals, but they capture him, drug him, so that, like others, so that he loses his mind and blind him. But his mind is not changed, and he prays. And Jesus says, "Hang on there, Matthias. I'm going to bring Odysseus. I'm sorry, going to bring Andrew to come and rescue you." So he goes there, and he rescues Matthias and the other cannibals. And does that sound like any story to you in the Odyssey?
yeah. I'm specifically remembering a instance of them drawing lots and him getting the small lot. He gets the small one, and so he has to go. Where doesn't he? Isn't that how he has to go to the land of the death, the land of Hades, or whatever?
No, I'm not thinking of that one. I'm not so sure. But what about Circe, who turns Odysseus's men into swine, and Odysseus has to go and rescue his men who have been turned into swine and lost their. And by the way, it is said that they are turned into, their minds are like those of animals, and they're given corn to eat. So this is quite clearly a undoing or an imitation of Odysseus and Circe's and Odysseus's men being rescued. But then there's a visit to the netherworld where where Andrew goes and rescues the most wicked and redeems them and so on. So this is one of the other places where early on said this has got to be an imitation of the Odyssey. I mean, this business about rescuing your men who have been turned into animals.
Oh, I see what you're saying. They're turned into an animal, and then they're asking to be saved and changed back into whoever they are, basically.
Right. So Andrew is doing what Odysseus did.
Yeah,
And they're turned in animals by a drug. So they're drugged, and the parallels go on and on.
yeah,
So one of the things that I wanted to emphasize before we go, I certainly have not exhausted the parallels between early Christian texts and Greek poetry and philosophy. I'm just a pioneer. I'm just pointing the way. And the way we're talking about and imagining and seeing other things is a part of the playfulness of the discipline that I think is lost when we think of things only theologically or historically. We need to think of them in terms of comparative mythology and fun. We need to be creative with these texts, as creative as the authors were, and not take them seriously, except that we're trying to find out who were they? What were their values? What is their attitude toward the beautiful and the good and the moral? What kind of gospel are they proclaiming? And so I think we've lost in theology our imaginations, our creativity, and we're interested in revealed truth or theological coherence. I think the beauty of these texts is into their messiness.
I agree. And I think that's the one thing. That's the problem when you have sort of a dogmatism, whereas you sort of can't. You can't. You're sort of forced to not be creative. Sort of forced to be the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Where I think like to their credit of like the Talmud, for example, we have a dialogue, and the dialogue sort of brings you to somewhere. There's an end, there's a finish line where the truth will emerge from these two dialogues. So I think that it's important to open things up and challenge each other, challenge these ideas a little bit, and see what happens. I think that's how you make progress.
Your viewers can find the Acts of Andrew through Pullbridge. You can get it on Amazon, and it really is quite inexpensive, probably under $20.
Yeah, I think so.
And
I'll put a link in the description.
Just have fun with it.
Yeah.
It's an amazing and seldom understood document.
Yeah, I put a link in the description for that particular book, and then also another link for your Amazon. Any other links that you want people to know about?
No, they can find them on Amazon.
Sure.
Or your channel, or Myth Vision, or
Myth
whatever.
Vision.
It's on YouTube.
Sure.
But I'm so privileged to have people like yourself who are interested in exploring this kind of thing, that are open-minded and curious. That really is the start of knowledge, it seems to me.
I agree. It's my pleasure. I have fun doing this stuff. I have fun reading these texts, and you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.